Okay, we'll start. So welcome to session 1D. This is around COVID-19 research. I suppose it's an area of research that we never thought even was possible 2 years ago when we met last time in Leeds physically. It's certainly become a massive part of our lives since then. So we've got 3 papers all showing connection to this idea, this theme very strongly, and reflects, I suppose, a lot of the current research which is going on around the world relating to COVID-19. So we're going to start with a paper called A Framework to Model the Spread of Infectious Diseases on Construction Sites Using Hybrid Agent-Based Modeling and Monte Carlo Simulations. So I'm going to play the presentation. At the moment, we don't have anybody to respond to this in terms of Q&A, but we'll maybe have them by the time we get to the end of the presentation. Okay, so I will play.
Dr. Nima Gerami Seresht, and I am a senior lecturer at the Department of Mechanical and Construction Engineering at Northumbria University. I will be presenting to you the research results of my research with Dr. RazaviAlavi, a colleague of mine at Northumbria University, on modeling the spread of the infectious diseases in construction projects. We were basically started with focusing on COVID-19, but the research results is more universal as the COVID-19. So let's remind you, I want to remind everybody about how hard we have as the construction community has been hit by COVID-19. The graph that we are looking at right now is the market capitalization for ARCOM, which is an international construction company. And we can see at the time of announcement of the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, there is a very sharp decrease in the market cap or the value of the company since then. And also similarly, we can see for the employments of the construction people at in the United States, which has been announced by the U.S. Bureau of the Statistics, there is a very sharp decrease in number of employments in construction industry between March 1st and May 1st, which we can see in the horizontal axis in here, which tells us what is the impact of COVID-19 on construction. And if we want to dig into this a little bit deeper, why construction has been hitting by the COVID-19 very severely as compared to the other industries. There are some other industries which are hit hard by COVID-19, but it's not as universal as we may think. Is that if you look into the background or what was the timeline of the lockdowns was happening in the United Kingdom, we can see between March 2020 into March 2021, there were a lot of restrictions for people working together, for people gathering, or having groups of people in different situations. And the construction as a whole, naturally, people need to work together in crews in order to deliver the project outcomes. So when there are a restriction on the group sizes or number of people working together, there will be the crews or the large crews in construction will be prohibited, and then we have delays in construction projects. That's why the construction, as compared to the other industries like manufacturing or whatever, that people can work individually, has been hit by the by COVID-19 a little bit harder. So now that we understand how hard was the impact of COVID-19 on construction, we need to make recovery from these negative impacts. And the way that we are going to approach this is that first we have to be able to predict and assess what are the impacts. So predicting the adverse impacts of COVID-19 on construction projects and assessing the potential changes made to the industry. So we need a predictive model in order to predict what are the impacts and what are the effective or how effective are our recovery plans. then we have to be able to run what-if analysis on these recovery plans. So once we have collected a number of recovery possible or potential recovery plans, we have to be able to test them, go through them, and see how effective each of them are, and what are the total costs for implementing each. And then it tells us what is the optimum one. So we are going to use the model that we have developed in the first place to run the what-if analysis and the results of what-if analysis in order to optimize the recovery plan. We are reducing the cost as much as possible and increasing the effectiveness as much as possible in the same time. What we have done in this research is the first step of this three-step recovery plan development. So we are developing a predictive model using agent-based modeling, which is a simulation technique, in order to predict the impacts of COVID-19. So what is agent-based modeling? Agent-based modeling is an emerging simulation technique in construction project management. It has been introduced by the first time by Dr. John van Neumann in computer sciences. He's a mathematician and computer scientist, and it has been introduced decades ago. However, the computers did not have the capacity or enough power in order to run it on consumer products. So the whole idea behind agent-based modeling was being kept as some theories rather than application until very recently that software packages being released and also programming languages became capable of running these simulation techniques. And it is a bottom to top simulation technique, or bottom up simulation technique, which means that we as the model need to identify or specify the characteristics of the very detailed elements of the project. For example, the trucks, the crews, the people, the equipment and the machinery, and the simulation model predicts the overall performance of the project or the global behavior of the system. So we are giving the specific ones at the very lowest level, and the model predicts the upper level predictions and tells us about the simulation model. The specific model that we have developed in this study, in this research for in predicting the spread of COVID-19, has three main components. The first is the project specification, which involves the project site size, warehouse location, and project duration, how long your project takes. Then the model will need to specify the crews specification, what is the project team size and the total number of crews. And finally, the disease specifications, which includes the infection rate, the transmission chance, the transmission range, and also the states of infection. We are going to dig into these a little bit deeper. So the first is the project site size, or the project specification. We are specifying, assuming that the project site is in rectangular shape, we are specifying the width and the height, and also the location of the warehouse. Also for the infection states, we have to tell the model how long does it take for a healthy agent, shown in green, to go into infection, to be infected. Then how long does it take to be contagious? Then once it is contagious, how long does it take to heal? And then if it's healed, or it's the agent will decease. So in this model specifically, we are not considering the disease or the mortality rate. We are only making a loop between the infection or healthy agent go back and forth. And finally, we have to specify the transmission range. What is the distance between two agents and the chance of transmission? Once these are specified, the model is predicting the number of agents at each state. This animation tells us, shows one example for the simulation model. In here at the very right, at the top left-hand side on top, we can see the number of healthy agents in the project. We can see that they are decreasing the number of agents as the number of infections are increasing on the site. In this one, on the left-hand side on the bottom, we can see the number of agents at the non-contagious state. Then we have the contagious state on the right-hand side on the top. And also the very bottom, it shows us the contagious and symptomatic state where the agents are being isolating for a few days. And as we can see in this animation, the number of agents are dropping, the healthy agents is dropping significantly. And after the first step, there is also a second rebound of the infection, or they call it the second peak or whatever, we can also the simulation model, in addition to the animation, it gives us the heat map, the number of agents at each location on the site for multi-steps and also the single steps. And finally, the histograms for a number of runs of simulation. For example, the number of healthy agents at each time step after 100 runs of simulation or 1,000 runs of simulation is being presented probabilistically. And these are the results of our research study. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any question through email or during the session today in the conference. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much for the presentation. And I might now try to see if the promise that was made in the last sentence of that about answering any questions is actually even possible. I don't know if we've got any of the presenters have managed to join in the time that we've been listening. I don't think so.
It doesn't look as if any of the presenters are with us at the moment. An interesting presentation, but maybe we'll come back to it at the end in case people do have some thoughts or some comments. Yeah. And perhaps by that point, maybe the presenters might be here with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly an interesting paper. I read this paper already, so I kind of got a good idea of where the authors were coming from when they were presenting. And to me, yeah, I think one thing I would really like to understand a bit more about this paper is just about where the roots of the paper come from, other research which has been done in a similar way, because there's quite a lot going on in the paper in terms of prediction and drawing models together, and just to see where it connects with probably regular health and safety research or other types of research, just to kind of see how we're adapting existing research a bit more. But
I was in a similar vein, Craig. When I read the paper, I thought to myself, it sounds great to be able to simulate and trying to predict overall performance. But for me, there's so many characteristics involved with COVID-19, and how does a simulation actually capture all of that and take account of it? So I suppose in terms of the reliability for me is a big question. How reliable and how accurate can we really be, particularly when one of the factors that they mentioned was the disease factors, and where do we get those disease factors from? Where's the access to that information? So those are the types of questions I was hoping that the authors could have shed some light on, but it certainly raises some very interesting points.
Yeah, I thought the use of agent-based modelling was interesting, and I think coming from architecture, there's a lot of agent-based modelling in urban theory, or I suppose urban design. And I guess I was wondering what the presentation doesn't really show is how those spatial aspects are incorporated into the model.
Yeah.
They talk a little bit about it in the paper, but I wanted to know a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, because again, connecting with the urban, you tend to drift into GIS, and being able to showcase using maps, and it'd be quite interesting to see how that could play out in a sort of construction project sense. Okay. So we're 35 minutes past 10 here in the UK, so we're going to move to maybe the next presentation. We have our presenter here, so we'll say welcome to them. And what we'll do is we'll play the presentation just so they're understanding what's happening. We'll play the presentation through the recording, and then we'll have 10 minutes for question and answers. So we'll be able to explore a bit more of that paper. Okay, so I'll press the button and then we'll see what happens.
Thank you everyone for being present to listen to me. My name is Chigozie Victor Ndukwe. I'm a third year PhD student at the University of Melbourne. The topic of our paper is the development of economic nationalism in Australia and implication for the construction supply chain. Introduction. This paper is motivated by the rising economic nationalist policies in the construction supply chain in Australia, especially in the state of Victoria, due to the strains caused by globalization to the local manufacturing industry. And the aim of this paper is to review scholarly works on the historical development of economic nationalism in Australia and its implication for the construction supply chain. The construction industry is a very, very important industry in the government's economic policy because construction receives a large portion of government's budget whenever it comes to expenditure. Construction is one of the ways through which government can stimulate the economy, especially when there are economic problems like the current pandemic. Let me define economic nationalism. Economic nationalism has been defined by economic liberals as a loose set of policies like protection, tariffs, export quotas, and local content policies, which do not fit into the liberal definition of how an economy should work. However, from the last 20 years, proponents of economic nationalism have redefined economic nationalism as a set of practices by government, business people, and trade unions and other actors that create, protect, and boost the local economy. So this set of practices are focused on the local economy to ensure that the fortunes of a nation are not left in the hands of the global forces of demand and supply in will not be able to take decisions concerning Australia. That means that decisions concerning Australia will be taken in capitals around the world. So they try to resist foreign ownership of Australian companies. They believe that Australian construction companies should be owned by Australians so that they can keep patronizing Australian manufacturers, especially with respect to building materials. However, from the 1980s, it became obvious that Australian capital alone cannot develop the Australian economy. This meant that economic nationalism now changed focus to industrial policy. So economic nationalists believe that Australian local industry, especially the manufacturing industry, should be supported to be able to compete in the global economy. They believe that the local manufacturer should be able to supply the local construction industry, and this is evident in the steel plan that was developed in the 1980s to sustain the steel industry and ensures that Australia continues to produce steel. So this went on till the late 1980s and early 1990s, when globalization became an irresistible force in the global market. This meant that Australia had to start removing tariffs, had to start signing more free trade agreements, and becoming more active in the World Trade Organization. After the accession of China to the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, Australian contractors began to buy more construction materials from China and other low-cost producers in Asia. This meant that Australian manufacturers now had to compete with foreign manufacturers, and Australian manufacturers were not able to compete, and this led to factory closures and laying off of workers in Australia, which caused problems of unemployment in Australia. So the government now thought of how to respond to this challenge, and this led to economic nationalism post-globalization. So one of the predominant components of economic nationalism post-globalization is buy local policies. For instance, in the state of Victoria in Australia, the local jobs first policy stipulates that for every government construction project that is worth $50 million and above, at least 90% of the materials, labor, and consultancy services must be procured from Australia or New Zealand. So the Victorian state government wants to ensure that Victorian money is spent and trapped in Victoria or in Australia, which will help to stimulate the local economy. They believe that this policy will provide revenue for local manufacturers to ensure that the local manufacturers continue to supply materials to the construction and focus on the local economy. Another one is emphasis on domestic production. The Australian federal government, in cooperation with the Victorian government, awarded a $150 million electricity subsidy to Portland Aluminium. Portland Aluminium produces about 20% of Australia's aluminium production, which is used to make windows and doors for the construction sector. So the government wants to ensure that this critical supply chain in the construction sector is protected and is sustained locally, is not allowed to die. So these are some of the components or some of the ways that economic nationalism has manifested post-globalization. To conclude, economic nationalism before globalization was aggressive, was resistant to foreign capital, it was tariff inclined. But post-globalization, economic nationalism has found a subtle way to coexist with globalization. It is no longer averse to foreign capital, but it is taking advantages of some of the loopholes in international trade, like support of SMEs, to ensure that local companies are supported. It has found a way to coexist with globalization. And for the construction industry, this implies that health contractors and subcontractors must develop local supply chains to be able to meet up with the local content laws that that will or may be developed to restart the economy post-COVID. So they must find a middle ground to have both foreign suppliers and local suppliers. For example, if there's another pandemic or another shutdown in China, what will the local contractors do? They have to buy locally, and if restrictions are imposed, they also have to buy locally. Or if the trade if the trade relationship between Australia and China continues to go bad, that means that they still have to buy locally. So contractors must develop local supply chains. They must have local suppliers to ensure that they are not caught unawares again during another pandemic or in case of another problem. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the presentation. I think very interesting overview on economic nationalism and from an Australian perspective. I think that's very good, interesting context to be thinking about. I don't know if our speaker is. I've seen him in the. Is he available?
Craig, I think, yeah, it should be available for activating the microphone and things.
Yeah.
If you want to give it a go.
Yep. Are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Very good to hear from you. So I think what we're going to do is just have a few questions from the people that are with us around the presentation. And I suppose to start us off, I just wanted to ask a question about where your research is going to go. As you said, you were in the early stages of your PhD. What's the kind of next stage of your research? How are you going to look at this in detail and design kind of a future research project?
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. I'm actually in the third year of my PhD,
okay.
And yeah, so this is like will I say, it's part of the things that my PhD is considering, but not really the central theme of my PhD, like this paper. So what I try to look at is the way that the government has responded to globalization with economic nationalism. But for my PhD, I've conducted data analysis to back up to find evidence of economic nationalism in the construction supply chain. So to develop it further, I intend to show the challenges caused by globalization to the construction supply chain, both for the head contractor, the subcontractor, the client, the government, the manufacturers, and how they are responding to the challenges. That's their responses. So yeah, so for my PhD, I wouldn't be focusing more on the history part of it. So I'll be focusing more on the present ways of economic nationalism, and also a little bit more on the manufacturers, because they appear to be the ones that are more exposed to the challenges of globalization. Thank you.
Very good, very good. Any questions from the floor, either through the chat or for any of our other presenters? Can ask a question very easily.
Yeah, I've got just one question. And Craig actually had asked the question that I had in mind in terms of where the PhD was going, and you answered that very well, I suppose. The other question, taking the research right back to the very beginning, what was the driving force behind the research area? What inspired you to do this particular research topic, given that there are vast areas within the built environment and construction management research? So In terms of the rationale and the driving force behind it, could you enlighten us of where the idea actually came from initially?
Yeah, okay, thank you for the question. The idea came from globalization. So my initial perspective to the construction supply chain was the impact of globalization, because in Australia there is a real problem in the economy because of the free trade agreement with China. There has been a lot of import competition to the manufacturers in Australia who are part of the construction supply chain. So over the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of them have closed down. A lot of them have laid off their workers, and a lot of the supply chain has been offshored to China and other low cost economies in Asia. And even COVID, although my research started before COVID, but the challenges that COVID brought, like the shutdown in China, the delay in shipping of construction materials, also kind of placed some emphasis on the need to strengthen the local construction supply chain to protect the economy from shocks like COVID and perhaps unfavorable trade relationships, and also to boost the local economy. So yeah, so the motivation started from globalization because it was obvious that the construction supply chain had changed over the past 10, 15 years, especially with the ascension of China to the World Trade Organization. And it was also obvious that people were losing their jobs and going into the unemployment benefit scheme, and the government was also paying money to kind of keep these people on the unemployment benefit scheme. So it is more like it's more like looking at how companies, that's especially manufacturers, have responded to this challenge and how they are helping to solve the problem, because the manufacturers are saying that they are keeping people in jobs. They are keeping people out of the unemployment register. They are saving money for the government. So the government should support them. If they employ people, they pay tax. They pay tax on each salary they pay. They also keep people out of the unemployment register. Yeah, so that is how it developed from globalization to the impact, the challenges, to the responses, which appears to be economic nationalism. So it's more like trying to look at this problem in a real life perspective, and then finding the economic or the academic theory to explain what has happened through globalization and through the response through economic nationalist policies. Thank you.
I've got a question. Chigozie, very interesting paper. I think the question I have for you in your thesis or in the paper, how do you begin to account for political ideology in relation to economic nationalism and the influence that might have on supply chains?
Yes, a very good question. Actually, I intend to, because Australia is divided between two major parties. That's the Australian Labour Party, and the nationalist, the national coalition with the Liberal Party. So the Labour Party seems to be more economic nationalistic. They seems to favor local industry policies. Like the government in Victoria is a Labour government, while the Liberal Party, which is the federal government, seems to be more liberal, sign more free trade agreements and so on. But I do not intend to examine the political influence of government on policies, like, because on a it looks on the surface that the Labour government will be more economic nationalistic. So I just intend to keep it to construction and to economics. I don't want to make it broad to start looking at the political factors, because it's going to be a very, very challenging and contentious area for me. So I intend to narrow it down to construction and economics alone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that response. I think it'd be a very interesting question to ask, I think, about politics and the influence of politics and that on nationalism in terms of economics. I think in the UK we've certainly got a really good example of where political ideology can affect economic direction quite strongly, in terms of the Brexit situation, and where the UK goes now. Will it be much different to before? We don't really know yet. But it is very much about nationalism and ideology. So I think it would be an interesting question, but I understand issues of scope when you're trying to do research. But sometimes problems are just complex. And that's part of the research, is to embrace that. But thank you very much. We're going to move to our next presentation now, which is by Peter. We've got some slides which he's prepared, so we'll put that on and we'll have a little listen, and then we'll ask.
Hi everyone, Dr. Peter Raisbeck from the Melbourne School of Design at Melbourne University. The title of this paper is Taking the Pulse, Developing a Model of Resilience Capital for Architectural Firms. At the beginning, the overarching aim was to understand what lessons about resilience can architects learn from pandemic-induced disruptions. This was done through analysing a series of nationwide surveys that have been conducted by the Architects Consulting Association of Australia. These surveys tracked the impact of COVID-19 lockdowns and project disruptions on firms during 2020. 5 national surveys were undertaken, beginning with lockdown 1 in March, and then there was also one at the end of March, one in June 2020, one in August 2020, particularly focused on Victoria. That was focused on the second lockdown in Victoria. I think Victoria is now up to lockdown 6, and finally in October 2020. The surveys were not designed through any scholarly research regime, but were designed by the ACA executive in consultation with its state boards and broader feedback from its members. In studies of the architectural profession, however, ideas of firm resilience have often been overlooked in favour of examining the well-being and mental health of employees. And this is supported by research. Architects more than engineers, quantity surveyors and project and construction managers, and female architects more than male professionals often feel stressed. Architects in Radin and Raisin found seem to have low professional worth. And yet, individual identity and its professional conflicts in architecture, the idea of the businessman or creative versus suit, have been extensively examined by Bos-DeVos and Volker. However, in many respects in the field of social work, for example, well-being is a contested issue for both policy and practice, and one that is primarily self-defined by researchers and participants. Individual resilience is also reliant on the social and physical context, and far more reliant on these things than individual traits, cognition, or talents. This self-definition or determination of self-definition in the research literature suggests that a broader consideration of firm resilience is needed. And certainly in well-being studies around architects, we might worry that self-identifying tropes of the architect are reinforced. Certainly the idea of the architect as a creative genius, a kind of knowledge worker who must be kept or made well, a worker who's treated as an atomistic commodity. Here's a summary of the surveys. You can see that the first survey at the beginning of the lockdowns, when there was a high degree of uncertainty in March 2020, there were 1,341 responses, trailing off to only 511 responses nationally in the final survey. Overwhelmingly, the respondents in the surveys were small firms, of the size of 1 to 5. And you can also see that between the first and the last survey, the percentage of casual workers in firms declined. And I think what happened was that firms tended to put off their casual workforce first before other full-time employees. And there's more details about that, including project cancels, stand-downs, and ratings of mental well-being in the paper. Pulse Check 4 is quite revealing, and it certainly shows the impact that the second longer 111-day lockdown had for Victorian architects, many of whom 80% of whom of those architects reported a decline in revenue. This was the most compared to other states. They had the lowest rating in the surveys for mental well-being, measured out of 5, and they also felt that their well-being was much lower than it was at the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdowns in March. The federal government had put in a JobKeeper wage subsidy program, and many of the architects, again, more Victorian architects, said that that had prevented redundancies over time. But the other thing is that you can see that for many of the architects, their pretty high proportions had only 2 to 3 months worth of work. So, out of this survey, we decided to have a look at the idea of resilience capital and develop a model around that from which further work could be done. And this is adapted from the work of Kurth. I think the details are in the paper. So resilience capital would include, in this context, the social and cultural context of the firms, the economic context of the firms, and which would include their finances, the institutional industry support that firms might get through various membership organisations, and their own networks, infrastructure and IT, which was quite important in the lockdown because many architectural firms in Australia went to a model of remote working and working at home, and that, I guess, leads to the next one of the environment of the workplace, which is more difficult for many people working at home if they were also parenting. The model suggests that there are a number of phases: the plan prepare phase and the absorb phase when a particular disruption occurs, in this case the pandemic. And it can be argued that the financial support of JobKeeper, the wage subsidy, helped many firms with different degrees of building their resilience capital at the outset of this disruption. But arguably, how firms employed this support determines how well they might do in the recovery phase. For example, in diagram 1, 2 model firms are contrasted. Firm A uses the wage support and other measures to maintain reduced operations in a competitive environment, whereas Firm B uses wage support to extend its operations, for example, using the support to price its fees to win work aggressively. In the absorb stage, according to this model, both firms look very much alike. And Firm B, perhaps because of increased activity and the quick expenditure of the wage support, may appear to have more outstanding performance. In a sense, in contrast, Firm A is actually using the wage support to build further resilience. And this, we can see, is that Firm B's strategy fails in the recovery stage because it has expended too many of its resources on unsustainable and low fee bids in the previous stage. It appeared to do well in the absorb stage, so appearing to do well in the absorb stage may not be a predictor of success in the following stages. The model thus points to why it's essential for firms to accurately consider resilience capital in the plan prepare stage, especially given the cyclical nature of the construction sector. The model also suggests what might happen if the absorb and recovery cycles were repeated due to sequential pandemic waves, which is essentially what is happening for Australian architects at the moment. So for architects, the need to develop industry-wide resilience data and actions across a range of context needs to recognise the interconnection and dependence of social and ecological systems, and see that these systems, given systems, may self-organise, and see that resilience is importantly a social process binding together individual actors, entities and broader systems. The RC model suggests further research is needed to determine how integrated psycho-social and ecological conceptions of resilience can shape and be enacted in the professional service firms than simply asking people and individual architects about their well-being. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Craig, sorry about the squeaky desk.
It's all right. Very good. But a great presentation, really challenging concepts to try to absorb and try to take forward. I think really relevant at the moment. I think as well architecture, certainly a profession that, you know, we obviously need to think about in the context of construction. Certainly comes into that debate where we're seeing in the first presentation about how it sits with the definition of construction management, but that's maybe a debate for a sort of different forum. I just want to open it up and see if anybody had any questions from the floor before I ask any of my own.
I had one, Peter, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It was interesting in the paper. I know that you had said, I think in Pulse 2, productivity was down by 30%, and I thought that was quite interesting because there's this conflicting view of productivity, and has it went up or has it went down over a period with people working at home? Is that good? You know, flexible working conditions now that we have. So the difference in Pulse Level 2 of it being down by 30%, and then obviously was there an increase later on?
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think what happened was that everyone had to move to remote working at home. And I think because of that move, and it wasn't something the architects were prepared for, that then had an impact on productivity in the second survey that was taken. I think the other thing which needs to be connected to that is that people were at home with their children. Absolutely. So not everyone in a workforce just went home and working, you know, like they would be working in an office. Yeah. Many people went home and were juggling parenting arrangements of one kind or another because kids were at school. So that was one thing. I think what happened was that this, and I think this is where the model I'm trying to develop may be of use, is that the firms that had better IT management and better IT infrastructure to begin with were the firms that were then, you know, I mean, this would be more research, but they would, I suspect they were the firms that were better at making that shift to working at home. Some people were saying that it depended on what kind of BIM license people had. There was one particular BIM license or version of BIM which meant that when you connected in, you weren't connecting to the actual model, the BIM model, that when you connected into your office, you were actually connected into a proxy model or something like that, and that could be then problematic. And the reason people had those proxy models was because they had a cheaper license. So I think those IT issues were really important. But then it just seemed after that, people adapted and kind of bounced back in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think once you overcome those initial hurdles, And once people are in that mode of, you know, accepting the fact that they are remote working, and like you said, if IT manages to get themselves in a position where, you know, there's correct access and there's, you know, capability to allow people to engage, then obviously there could be an argument that productivity then actually went up overall, with people not travelling back and forth to sites and locations and other factors as well. It's really interesting to see the development of the different pulse responses, and some really, really good response rates there as well. So certainly really interesting. Thanks for that, Peter.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. I think, I mean, for myself, I was trying to understand I suppose the dynamic of how an architect works, you know, in what we might call normal times. Was there a drift towards home working anyway? I mean, is it one of those professions in the built environment where it's more likely to work at home?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think prior to the pandemic, I think architects in Australia were maybe thinking a little bit about flexible working. And I think there's still, by and large, the discussion prior to the pandemic was about the culture of long hours and the culture of, you know, staying at work, working all night, not leaving, not looking after yourself. So I think, and then I think there's, prior to the pandemic, creeping into that was some discussions or ideas about, we should be more flexibly working. You know, architects don't even have proper parental leave for either men or women in Australia. But I think because of the pandemic, that's all changed, because now people have to be flexible. I think, you know, if you did a follow-up survey, we could probably ask people, are they happy working at home? Do they ever want to go back to their office? You know, some people will say yes because they want to get away from their kids. Other people will say no. And then possibly some people will say, hey, I don't want to go back to the office because I want to get back into that culture of long working hours and low professional work. So I think, there would be quite a few things in there to pursue. I should add that, particularly in relation to the productivity question, and even in the relation to this, the problem was that, I mean, these surveys, I was really only just brought in to have a look at them and analyse them. But the surveys, as they developed, no two surveys were the same. And I think there was no, you know, if the ACA had said, oh, look, let's look at productivity and these are the measures that we'd have, or let's look at remote working, and these are the measures we'd have, all these other things, and track those through consistently between each survey. I think in some ways that would have been better. But the problem was, you know, they developed the surveys, well, essentially in an ad hoc way as an immediate response to what they saw as being the external circumstances and what members were telling them. So,
very interesting. Yeah,
interesting.
And I think yeah, isn't it? I think you've got the other factor, which I think is really interesting as well in the results. You've obviously got the fortunes of the firm in terms of economically how they've managed to perform in the market during these periods, but also you've got the workplace environment factor as well, and it's be interesting to see how, I suppose, the impact of one on the other.
Yeah.
You know, if you had two firms that were doing well in the market, generally, how does any difference in the workplace environment? That would really be quite a big factor on productivity.
And I think that's maybe where my resilience capital model that I've developed would be worth using that to then test through various, you know, survey methods or interview methods. I think I think it's just, I can't remember what I was going to say. Sorry. I think, yes, no, I know what I was going to say. Look, what I was really trying to do was to connect those kind of well-being factors that they were asking in the surveys to the economic factors. Like, you know, there were issues about whether or not people were had to be stood down, you know, issues about loss of revenue, issues about how much work that they had. You know, so there were measures of financial factors in the surveys. And then I was trying to match them to the well-being metrics that they sort of had in the surveys. But because of the way that they'd set up the surveys, making those things, making that connection explicitly, you know, in some quantitative way. I mean, I could probably go back and do some correlations, but I'm not even sure that it would work. I think is really where the survey design might have failed. So, but still all very interesting.
Absolutely. And I think long term as well, I think that's the other big factor of research that this is, you know, we're going to build, you know, in the next few years, you know, the patterns will become more meaningful, I suspect, as we kind of look back, you know, at what's been going on and try to understand where firms are in a few years' time. I mean, that will be really interesting.
And see, most of the resilience studies have been in, you know, disaster, you know, an emergency and, you know, maybe OC health and safety. Very few have been focused on, you know, small professional service firms or small firms with knowledge workers or, you know, even small construction firms. So I think those were sort of the broader lessons that I was trying to get out of it.
Very good. Very good.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's been excellent. And thank you to all our presenters. Thank you for participants for being here